a lot going on in the news, but you know, there's also some very big, very real, bigger picture things going on as well. Well, that's funny. I got two tally lights going on here. Anyhow, there's a shooting. There's a school shooting in Maryland. It appears so far that it's, you know, disgruntled student upset with girlfriend sort of thing, and that he was stopped by the school resource officer, aka the cop in the school. Which, if this is the case, that means that the NRA will be saying, "See, a good guy with a gun finally did stop a bad guy with a gun." Whew. Amazing. So we'll continue with that. We'll be, you know, keep you up to date on that. Another bomb went off on its way to Austin, apparently this time, and this is the first one that was actually shipped, which raises the question: is this a whole new bomber? Are we seeing copycats now? Or, and I don't mean that to laugh. I mean, it's just like that. You know, sorry if it sounded that way, but it's just, this is the way these things happen in the United States so often, and I think this is what we're seeing in the whole school shooting phenomena. Is, you know, a couple of kids pull it off and they get enormous publicity for it, and pretty soon it becomes a thing, right? And then, you know, people start doing it, and it's extraordinarily destructive. And we really need to get these weapons of war off the streets of America. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Whether that played any role in the Maryland shooting or not, I don't know. And it doesn't matter, because we are seeing people all across the country being killed by these weapons of war constantly. The other story, though, and yesterday was the anniversary. Yesterday was the day that 15 years earlier, the United States invaded and destroyed the country of Iraq. And there's a piece of this story that absolutely nobody was talking about in the media yesterday. And I think it's like the most important part of the story. And so I wanted to bring it to your attention. The usual storyline about why Iraq fell apart after the United States invaded was that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney failed to put together a post-war plan, right? The magic phrase, oh, they didn't have any post-war plan. Actually, that's wrong. And Naomi Klein wrote a piece in the September 2004 issue of Harper's Magazine titled Baghdad Year Zero that really lays this out. And it's one of the most brilliant pieces. And I remember reading it at the time thinking, oh my God, you know, this is huge news. But there's been virtually no coverage of it. The plan was to lay out as much honey as possible and wait for the flies. In other words, they were going to seed the ground in Iraq economically, the structural ground, so that corporations would want to come into Iraq and wealthy individuals would want to come into Iraq and invest. Iraq was to be an experiment in libertarianism, an experiment in absolute free trade. No tariffs, no boundary, no border barriers, you know, to crossing the border, complete free trade. You know, Baghdad was going to become the new Hong Kong. This was the idea that L. Paul Bremer, Dick Cheney, and Don Rumsfeld had, these good libertarians. And they had been, I mean, they tried this in Chile with was it Allende? No, it was, yeah. And, you know, it was just a flaming disaster. I mean, they've tried this in a couple of places, and it really hasn't worked out all that well. But here you had a country of 25 million people, and it was going to be rebuilt by greed. This was the thing for Iraq. Yes, let's build this country based on greed is good, the core libertarian philosophy. So in order for that to work, in order for the Republican/libertarian theology to work, you have to shrink the state down to almost nothing. Your workforce has to be completely deunionized so they are, quote, flexible. You have to open your borders. You have to reduce your taxes to virtually zero. You have to get rid of tariffs and no restrictions on foreign ownership within your own country. Now, these are things no other country has ever done before because no other country is flat out, you know, bat guano crazy. But this is what the Bush administration mandated for Iraq. It was, by the way, a violation of international laws. It was a violation of several UN treaties. We'll get to that in a minute. But this was what they did. They would, you know, well, here are the adjustments, right? These so-called 2 months before the war began, the USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, began drafting a work order to be handed out to a private company to see, quote, to oversee Iraq's transition to a sustainable market-driven economic system. So this is what this was all about. This was an economic experiment that killed 1 million people in the name of libertarianism. The first thing that L. Paul Bremer did when he got to Iraq is he fired 500,000 government employees, most of them soldiers, but also, to quote Naomi Klein, but also doctors, nurses, teachers, publishers, and printers. Next, he flung the country's borders open to absolutely unrestricted imports, no tariffs, no duties, no inspections, no taxes. And he declared that Iraq was open for business. And now, at this point, Cheney and Bremer and Rumsfeld fully expected that corporations all over the world would go, oh, wow, this is the new Hong Kong. No regulations, no import tariffs, no nothing. And we can come into Iraq and we can start our own company. We can own 100% of it. There doesn't have to be we don't have to have a domestic partner like you'd have to have in China or Vietnam. This is going to be great. This is, to quote Naomi Klein, the largest state liquidation sale since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were over 200 major companies that were owned all entirely or in part by the Iraqi government. They were all given away. Order 37 lowered took Iraq's top corporate tax rate as a progressive income corporate tax rate up to 40%, reduced that to a flat 15% rate, and no taxes on imports and exports. Order 39 allowed foreign companies or billionaires to own 100% of Iraqi assets, which is, by the way, against the law, but nonetheless they did it. And you could take 100% of the profit that you make in Iraq out of the country and not pay any taxes to Iraq on it at all. They sent welcome notices to 40 different foreign banks saying you will not be regulated if you come here to do business. And the only law from Saddam Hussein that they maintained was a law that explicitly made it illegal to form a trade union and made it illegal to engage in collective bargaining. So, to quote Naomi Klein, overnight, Iraq went from being the most isolated country in the world to being, on paper, its most wide-open market. That autumn, she writes, was awash in rebuilding Iraq trade shows. Remember these? This is 2003, late 2003? The fall of 2003 in Washington, Madrid, London, Amman. The Economist magazine described Iraq under L. Paul Bremer as, quote, a capitalist dream. Joe Albaugh, a former Bush-Cheney campaign manager, started a new company called New Bridge Strategies to bring people in. One of the country's partners said one well-stocked 7-Eleven could knock out 30 Iraqi stores. A Walmart could take over the country. See, here's your opportunity, foreigners, to economically colonize Iraq. We're going to turn this country into a libertarian experiment. This was all Tom Friedman's idea. I mean, this is right where it came from. And in Paul Wolfowitz's AID contract, for example, in the 108 pages of the contract, the word privatization was mentioned 51 times. Iraq was a radical experiment in libertarian ideology. Sinan Antoon wrote a piece for yesterday's New York Times titled, 15 Years Ago, America Destroyed My Country. And Sinan makes the point that, you know, as much as he hated Iraq, I'm assuming it's he, that just from the name, but I could be wrong. I don't know. But in any case, Sinan is writing about how basically you can't say that you did anything other than destroying my country. And, you know, he says, I returned to Baghdad in 2013. The American tanks were gone, but the effects of the occupation were everywhere. I was disheartened by the ugliness of the city I'd grown up in. This was Baghdad, horrified by how dysfunctional, difficult, and dangerous daily life had become for the great majority of Iraqis. And this is like the second time around for Iraq, by the way. You know, George Herbert Walker Bush, after Maggie Thatcher, when she busted the coal union, she was very unpopular. So what did she do? She had a little war in the Falkland Islands. That got her reelected. Ronald Reagan, similarly, busting the unions. He was very unpopular going into 1985, 84, 85. And so what did he do? He had a little war in Grenada, and it got him popular and it got him reelected. And so George Herbert Walker Bush's idea was, well, let's have a little war in Iraq and see how that works out, right? And that little war turned into this vast privatization. Well, the first Bush war was really just for political purposes, and it didn't even work. I mean, he didn't hold the country long enough to be a wartime president at the time of the election, which his son pointed out. So this is the genesis of this libertarian experiment. It never gets mentioned in the U.S. media outside of Naomi Klein's excellent reporting.